Our last film, The Lodger, was of course a silent film, and Alfred Hitchcock actually shot this next film we're going to watch, Blackmail, as a silent film too. However, the studio producing this film really felt the pressure to make a sound film after the huge success of this film called The Jazz Singer in the United States, which was of course the first popular sound film and really the film that ushered in what's known as the sound revolution in cinema history. So after Blackmail was completed as a silent film, the studio asked Hitchcock to reshoot portions of the film for sound and to make it essentially into a sound film. And Hitchcock agreed. In fact, he quite enthusiastically welcomed the advent of sound because it gave him much more control, especially of things like the music that a film would have. He said, I have always believed that the coming of sound opened up a great new opportunity. The accompanied music came at last entirely under the control of the people who made the picture. So, and Hitchcock was all about controlling his picture. He had a very distinct vision of what he wanted. So, really, this advent of sound, he really felt like it gave him much more control over everything and every aspect of his films than he had had before. At the time that Blackmail was released, there were then essentially two different screenings for public audiences. The film screened as a silent version, and it also screened as a sound version. And this was because not all cinemas at that time in England were equipped for sound. The technology was still very new, and it was very expensive to make the transition. So only 22% of theaters had sound then in England. There was another interesting wrinkle with Blackmail as this film that began as a silent film and then switched to being a sound film. Essentially, there was this problem with the lead actress, played by a woman named Annie Andra. She was a wonderful actress, but she had a very strong Polish Czech accent. And her accent, of course, wouldn't have mattered if she starred in a silent film, because, of course, no one could hear that accent. But in the switch to sound, you couldn't have an actress playing the character of a London shop girl, a character who would have had a very specific British accent. You couldn't have a character like that, being played with a strong Eastern European accent. So, and essentially, a London shop girl character with that European accent simply wouldn't have been believable. So, and we should note, kind of related to this actually, the switch to sound in the film industry really quite tragically destroyed the characters of many silent film stars because of their voices. Either they had accents that the studios really thought the public wouldn't like, whether because of prejudice or bias or some other reason, or maybe the actors had voices that didn't match their persona, the persona that the public thought they should have, or perhaps the actors just didn't really have great voices for sound. Now, in this case, for Blackmail, the film was completed; it was finished, so they couldn't really reshoot the whole thing with a different actress. So they kept the original actress, Annie Andra, in all her scenes, but they got another actress, this English actress named Joan Barry, and what she would do is she would sit off to the side while they were reshooting certain scenes they needed for dialogue. And Joan Barry then would essentially say the words, and Annie Andra would mouth the words. Or in some cases, Joan Barry would simply record the sound dialogue for those scenes, and they would put that recorded dialogue over the film. And you might notice a few times where there's this lip to sound mismatch, but mostly it's really quite successful, where you have Joan Barry essentially speaking the dialogue for Annie Andra, who is doing all the physicality of the performance. You will also notice relative to this film that there is the first whole section of the film is still rendered as a silent film, maybe the first 10 to 15 minutes or so. And then at one point, gradually you'll start to hear conversation coming in. And from that point on, it is a sound film. Hitchcock really felt that that first 10 minutes or so was just as effective as a silent film, and he wanted to keep the quick editing and the fluidity of the camera that if he had tried to add sound to that section, he wouldn't have been able to do. Many early sound films were, in fact, a hybrid of sound and silent filmmaking. Some portions of these very early films, these early sound films, were not fully sound. They were kind of this hybrid. Even the very first sound film that I mentioned, The Jazz Singer, was in many larger portions of the film still a silent film. So Blackmail is very much like that in the sense that it is a sort of a silent sound hybrid. Keep in mind that this is very, very early in sound production. Again, The Jazz Singer is 1927. This is still in 1929. Again, many of the cinemas didn't even have the equipment to play sound film. And on the set, during production, they didn't have many of the things that we have to make films today. They didn't have even very simple things like a boom mic. A boom mic wasn't invented yet. And a boom mic, of course, is that mic that's suspended on the end of a very long pole, and you can hang the mic over the top of an actor. And it's of course out of sight of the camera, and you can pick up the sound, and you can move with the actors as they're going. And just the simple invention of the boom mic gave the filmmaking much more flexibility. You could have the actors move more, you could have the camera move more when the boom mic was invented. But that was not, they did not have the boom mic yet in 1929. A lot of very early sound filmmaking meant that the camera had to be quite still. You couldn't move very much because it would mess up the mic placement and the sound recording. So there was a lot more restrictions on these early sound films. And that's something to keep in mind, that Hitchcock would have had to be working with that. Some things for you to be watching for as you watch this film. Now, of course, Hitchcock, as we've been talking about, really loved visuals and visual storytelling, and we'll continue to talk about his really brilliant visual storytelling throughout the quarter as well as in this film. But you will see his innovations and his skill and his experiments with sound here too. Even at this very, very early stage of sound filmmaking, he was already starting in his very first sound film to think about how he, as a filmmaker, could play with sounds in spite of the limitations of the sound technology as it was really in its infancy. So as you're considering with this first sound film of his, think about how he chooses to do things like withhold sound. He had the capacity to use sound, but sometimes he chooses to use silence, and silence can be just as effective as sound in many cases. For example, when you see a person saying something, but you don't hear the words, that's very simple way of playing with our suspense. We see that they're saying something, but Hitchcock will deliberately withhold the words from us. And by that simple kind of technique, he stirs our curiosity and thus the tension. For example, there's one instance when Alice, our main character, played by this actress Annie Andra, she laughs as someone whispers something into her ear, but we never get to hear what is said. So a very simple moment, but Hitchcock withholds the sound from us. You'll also notice that he uses ambient sound or environmental sound really effectively. So kind of notice what's happening in the film's environment, things like how traffic noises are used. And these ambient sounds really contribute to the feel of the scene and or to our understanding of a character's psychology and their state of mind. You can also notice how Hitchcock uses phones and phone booths and phone calls in this film, both the sound of phones, but also using a phone booth to characters go in and out of a phone booth, and we are cut off from sounds, or we are not hearing their dialogue in certain ways. So the phone booth is a really interesting space for sound and withholding sound. Hitchcock also really creatively uses something called a sound bridge in this film, where the sound from the next scene starts in the scene that we're currently watching, and then we're carried by the sound into the new scene. Often a sound bridge in film is music, but here Hitchcock uses specifically a sound, and to be even more specific, he uses a scream in a really effective transition. Also note the musical score here in the film, or sometimes the lack of musical score in some instances. Notice what kind of music he uses. Notice now that he has more choice, again, he is able to choose what kind of music he wants to put in his film. And so there's a very specific theme, musical theme, for example, that keeps coming back throughout the film that really helps trigger our understanding of the character's psychology. Also notice the use of diegetic music and non-diegetic music. Diegetic music is music within the world of the film that the characters can hear and respond to. And non-diegetic music is things like the score. So that's the music that we as the audience hear, but the characters don't hear. And there's actually quite a bit of this diegetic music in Blackmail where the characters are hearing the same music that we're hearing. So characters in this film, they do things like whistle, they hum, they sing, they play the piano. And you might ask yourself why Hitchcock chose this diegetic form of music. And think about how he uses things like singing and humming and whistling to develop things like tension and plot and character. Also, notice the really creative use of dialogue here. There's one really famous scene in this film that will stand out to you, and how Hitchcock uses dialogue as a sound as much as for the actual words. Where, in other words, the dialogue is more about how the words sound than about what they mean. And that sound of the words is used to develop the psychology of the character and to really immerse us in her perspective. In terms of visual storytelling, you should pay attention to how Hitchcock is using visuals here in many, many ways to tell the story as much as he's using the sound. Apart from the very beginning of the film, there are really long sequences with no sound at all, and he really wants us to pay attention to the visual storytelling. There's one really fabulous sequence, for example, where this traumatic event has happened to our leading character, Alice, and Hitchcock gives us no dialogue in the scene following the trauma, and we understand her trauma primarily by way of the visuals. So really pay attention to how he is using those visuals to immerse us in her psychology and her emotion and her point of view, and to again tell the story with visuals. Last, keep looking, as you should in every film that we're going to be watching this quarter, for these reoccurring Hitchcock motifs and themes. So notice the use of the blonde, the leading lady in Peril. Consider the characters of the policemen. Think about how Hitchcock portrays them. You will see a police force here, and then there is a very significant character who is a policeman, and he's a supporting role in the film. It's akin to the police figure in The Lodger. Also, notice the tension thematically here between duty and love. There are choices that characters make, whether they should fulfill their duty or whether they should pursue love. There's a related theme of pursuing justice or pursuing truth. And that's really a recurring tension in Hitchcock's work, and it's really beautifully developed here. You also notice the presence of a likable criminal or a charming criminal. There are potentially two or actually three criminals, we might say, in this film that are in some way charming or sympathetic. And it's quite interesting the way that that develops a sense of moral ambiguity. Also notice just related to that idea of a likable criminal, the sense of moral uneasiness or moral ambiguity that's in this film, where, for example, the quote unquote good guys are not necessarily good and the bad guys are not necessarily purely bad. And the film does leave us, especially at the end, with a really interesting sense of moral ambiguity and a kind of an ethical problem. It's not a very tidy ending in some ways. Also noticed the presence of birds in this film. Hitchcock had this kind of lifelong obsession and fascination with birds. He didn't really trust them. He kind of thought of them as harbingers of something bad. Oftentimes in his film, when you see a bird, something bad is about to happen, or there's some kind of symbolic element there. So notice the use of birds in this film. Also, note the theme of guilt. it ties to the wrong man theme. And there are potentially a couple of actually wrong man characters in this film where someone is innocent that is being accused of a crime. But it's a little bit more complex in the last film that we watched, but it is still it's swirling around this idea of guilt and of around the wrong man theme. A couple of other things. Notice the use of handcuffs in this film. Also notice the presence of the staircases and how Hitchcock uses them. They're quite thematically interesting, kind of moving between two different spaces, spaces of safety and then spaces of perhaps danger. Note the presence also of mirrors and mirroring characters. There are characters that are very similar to each other in some ways, and they kind of function as doubles or mirrored opposites. There's also the trope of a character falling from a high place that repeats in several of Hitchcock's films, and you'll see that here. And then also, finally, notice the Hitchcock cameo. This happens quite early in the film. In the very beginning, you see the image there on the bottom right-hand corner where there's a little boy playing with Hitchcock's hat. So it's quite a fun cameo, and it happens quite early in the film. So look out for that. All right, that's it. I'll look forward to talking with you about the film after you've